First thing I told Renee, my new wife, was that I worked the night desk at the inn where we'd been living since the wedding. That part was true. What I never told her was that I owned the inn, and the two rental houses on Magnolia Street, and the small commercial property on Route 9 that brought in steady income every single month. I let her believe I was just the man behind the counter, quiet, reliable, nothing remarkable. And in the 3 weeks I'd known her before the wedding, she had never asked the right questions. Looking back now, that tells you everything. My name is Walter. No, wait. Let me start over. My name is Bernard. I'm 64 years old, and I've made a lot of good decisions in my life. I raised 2 children, mostly on my own, after my wife Gloria passed from ovarian cancer 11 years ago. I kept the house. I kept the business. I kept going. That's what you do. Gloria and I had built everything together, slowly, carefully, the way people used to do things before everyone wanted it fast. She was an elementary school librarian. I ran a small landscaping company for 22 years before I sold it and used the money to buy the inn up in Asheville, North Carolina. We had plans to retire there together, run it as a family business, sit on the porch in the evenings and watch the mountains go dark. She died 8 months before we were supposed to move in. I moved in anyway. I didn't know what else to do. For 4 years I ran it alone. My daughter Carolyn drove up from Charlotte on weekends sometimes. My son Marcus had his own life in Atlanta and called when he remembered. The staff became my family in the quiet way that happens when you work alongside people long enough. My front desk manager Dottie had been with me 3 years. She knew when to leave me alone and when to bring coffee. I was not looking for anyone. I want to be clear about that. I met Sylvia at a fundraiser for the local Humane Society. One of those events where people wear their good clothes and eat cheese off little crackers and bid on things they don't need. My friend Roger had dragged me. He said I was turning into a fixture in my own lobby. He wasn't wrong. Sylvia was warm. That was the first thing. She laughed easily and she asked questions and she looked at you when you talked, really looked, like what you were saying mattered. She told me she'd moved to Asheville 2 years ago after her divorce, that she was starting over, that she loved the mountains and the slower pace and the people. I told her I ran the night desk at an inn nearby. I don't know exactly why I said it that way. Some part of me, some cautious and quiet part that Gloria had always called my watchfulness, just held back. I said it casually, the way you mention a job. I didn't correct it. I just let it sit there. She seemed interested anyway. We had dinner 3 times over the next 2 weeks. She was funny and easy to talk to, and she touched my arm when she made a point, and she smelled like something warm and familiar I couldn't quite name. I told Carolyn about her over the phone, and there was a pause before my daughter said, "That's fast, Dad." I said I knew. She said, "How well do you actually know her?" I said well enough. Carolyn got quiet in the way she gets quiet when she disagrees but doesn't want to fight. Sylvia had a son. She mentioned him on our second dinner, almost in passing. His name was Donovan, she said. 23 years old, going through a rough patch, staying with her temporarily while he figured things out. I asked what kind of rough patch. She waved her hand and said, "You know how young people are." I let it go. On our third dinner, she told me she thought she was falling for me. She said she hadn't felt this way since she was young. She said meeting me had felt like grace. I am 64 years old, and I have been lonely for a long time. I know what loneliness does to your judgment. I know this. And still, we got married 6 weeks after we met. Justice of the peace, small ceremony, Roger as my witness, one of Sylvia's friends as hers. Carolyn did not come. She said she couldn't get away from work, but I knew better. She sent flowers. The card said, "I love you, Dad. Please be careful." I read it standing in my own front desk and felt a small, uncomfortable thing move through my chest. Donovan arrived the afternoon of the wedding. I had known he was staying with Sylvia in her apartment across town. But Sylvia said it made more sense now, of course, for him to move into the inn with us. We had the space. She'd already spoken to him about it. I hadn't been consulted, but I smiled and said of course we'd make it work. He shook my hand with the kind of grip that is trying too hard. He looked around the lobby of the inn with an expression I recognized, the look of someone taking inventory. I told myself I was being uncharitable. That night, after the small dinner Dottie had arranged for us in the private dining room, Sylvia and I sat on the back porch looking out at the tree line. It was a clear evening in late October, and the air was cold and sweet. I thought about Gloria for a moment, the way I always do during good moments, as if I need to check in with her somehow. Sylvia put her head on my shoulder and said, "I'm so happy." I said I was too, and I meant it, mostly. The next morning, Donovan was already in the kitchen when I came down at 6:30. He'd made himself completely at home in a way that felt practiced, not comfortable. He was eating cereal and looking at his phone, and he said, without looking up, "Bernard." Just my name. "No, sir. No good morning, just my name like he was reading it off a list." I said good morning and poured my coffee. "We should talk sometime," he said, "about the setup here." I asked what he meant by the setup. He shrugged and gestured vaguely at the inn around us. "Just how things work, what the situation is. Mum said you managed the place." I said I did. "What does that involve exactly? Like, are there benefits? Is it salaried?" I looked at him for a moment. He was still looking at his phone. I said we could talk about it sometime and took my coffee out to the front porch. I told myself it meant nothing. Young people asked blunt questions. It was a different generation. He was just curious. I called Carolyn from the porch. She picked up on the second ring the way she always does when she's already been thinking about me. I told her the wedding had been lovely. She said she was glad. Then she said, quietly, "And how's everything else?" I said fine. I said Sylvia's son was here. Carolyn got quiet again. "Dad," she said. "Don't," I said. "I'm just saying." "I know what you're saying. Everything is fine." There was a pause. She said, "Okay, call me if you need to." I hung up and sat there with my coffee and the cold mountain air, and I thought about Gloria and what she would have said. Gloria had a gift for cutting to the center of things without being unkind about it. She would have sat across from me and tilted her head slightly and said something simple and precise that I would have resisted and then turned over in my mind for 3 days until I admitted she was right. I missed her so much right then it felt like a physical thing. The shift happened on the second day. Sylvia and I were having breakfast when she said, conversationally, "Donovan is going to need a car." I waited. "He can't really get around up here without one. It's not like the city." I said that was true. Asheville wasn't easy to navigate without a vehicle. I was thinking we could help him with that. I put my fork down. I said we had just gotten married yesterday. I said I thought we might give ourselves a little time before we started making large financial decisions together. Sylvia laughed, a short, dismissive sound. She said it wasn't a large financial decision. It was just a car, something used, a few $1,000s. She said she would pay me back from her account. She just didn't have the liquidity right now. I asked when she expected to have the liquidity. She looked at me in a new way then. Something had shifted in her face. It wasn't angry exactly, it was assessing. She said, "I thought we were partners." I said we were. I also said that partners discussed things before making commitments on behalf of both of them. She smiled tightly and changed the subject. That evening, Donovan found me in the small office off the lobby where I handled the inn's bookings. He knocked once and leaned in the doorway. "Hey, I wanted to run something by you," he said. He wanted to talk about work. Not his work, mine. He had been thinking, he said, about how the inn operated, and he had some ideas about revenue streams. He said he'd done some research. He was confident, the way young people are confident when they have no information but have convinced themselves otherwise. I listened carefully, not to what he was saying, it was vague and half-formed, but to what he was doing. He was positioning himself. I had seen this before in business, the early stages of someone trying to establish themselves as valuable before they reveal what they actually want. I thanked him and said I'd think about it. He said it would help if I understood more about the ownership situation here. Like, who do you report to? Is it a management company? I said it was a private arrangement. He nodded slowly. But you've been here a while. You must have a good relationship with whoever owns it. I said I did. He seemed to be waiting for more. I turned back to my computer. After a moment he left. I sat very still for a while after that. I have not built everything I have built by being naive. I sold a business. I negotiated contracts. I bought properties when other people said the market was wrong, and I turned out to be right. I read people. Gloria always said I was too slow to trust. But when I trusted, I was all in. That was my weakness, she said. Not the slowness, the all in. I thought about Sylvia's laugh that morning, the assessing look, the way she had moved from warm to something else so quickly. I called Roger that night from my car in the parking lot. I told him what had happened. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always valued about Roger. When I finished, he said, "What does she know about what you own?" I said she knew I managed the inn, that was all. He said, "Keep it that way for right now." I said I already was. He said, "Bernard, are you okay?" I said I didn't know yet. On the third day, Sylvia sat down across from me at the small table in our room with her hands folded and the look of someone who has rehearsed what they are about to say. She began with us. She talked about what she wanted our life to look like, how much she was looking forward to building something together, how she saw the inn as a foundation for something larger. I listened and I watched her hands, which were very still. Then she said that she had looked into things a little, just because she cared about our future, and she understood that the inn was doing well. She'd noticed the bookings on the computer in the office, my computer in my office, which she had apparently gone into without mentioning it. She said she was no expert, but it looked like a solid operation. She said she thought it was time for me to talk to the owner about a different arrangement, something more formal. A stake in the business, maybe, given my years of dedication. She said any reasonable owner would see the value in that. I looked at her for a long time. She kept going. She said that Donovan had potential and that this environment could be good for him, but he needed to be brought in with something real, not just odd jobs. She said she didn't want handouts. She wanted something sustainable. She said all of this in a measured, reasonable voice while her hands stayed very still in her lap. Then she said, "Don't you think it's time to have that conversation? It's time to think about all of us now, not just yourself." I thought about Gloria. I thought about the 12-hour days she worked at the library to help us buy our first rental property. I thought about the summers we didn't take vacations because we were reinvesting. I thought about her handwriting on the mortgage papers, the careful loops of her signature. I thought about the inn on the day I first walked through it, before we bought it, how she had stood at the back window and looked at the mountains and turned to me with tears in her eyes. Not sad tears, happy ones. I thought about all of this very quickly, in just a few seconds, sitting across from Sylvia and her folded hands. I said, "You know what, let me look into that." She smiled. It was a relieved smile, the smile of someone who has been holding their breath. "I knew you'd understand," she said. I smiled back. I excused myself to make a phone call. I called my attorney, Phil Draves, who had handled the property purchases and the business arrangement when I bought the inn. I told him what was happening in broad strokes. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Good thing she doesn't know the ownership structure." I said that was my thought too. He said, "You want to talk about options?" I said I did. We talked for 45 minutes. That evening, I asked Dottie, quietly, if she'd noticed anything unusual. She looked at me steadily and said she'd noticed that someone had been in the booking system, not just looking, but poking around in the financial records. The access was logged. It had happened twice. I thanked her. She didn't ask any questions. That is why Dottie has worked for me for 3 years. Over the next week, things escalated slowly, and then all at once. Donovan started referring to the inn as the property, as in, what are the plans for the property? Who handles maintenance decisions for the property? Is the owner looking to expand the property? He did this casually, like it was just conversation, but it happened every single day. Sylvia stopped asking and started suggesting. She suggested Donovan should be added to the staff list officially. She suggested they might want their own vehicle for in-business. She suggested that given how much she was contributing, and here she paused as if gesturing at contributions that were invisible to me, it would make sense to have some kind of formal recognition in the business. One morning, she left a document on the kitchen table. It was a printout about adding a spouse to a business partnership, pulled from a legal website. She hadn't circled anything or highlighted anything. She just left it there for me to find. I folded it carefully and put it in my desk drawer and said nothing. I was not angry. That surprised me. I had expected to feel betrayed, wounded, the dramatic emotions of a man who has been deceived. What I felt instead was a deep and clarifying sadness. Not for myself, but for what this was. For what she had reduced something to. For the waste of it. I thought about Carolyn's card. Please be careful. I called her that night. When she answered, I said, "You were right." She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "Dad, I'm so sorry." She wasn't saying I told you so. That's not who Carolyn is. She was just sorry. I had to stand in the parking lot for a while after I hung up. Phil and I had 3 more calls. I want to be careful about the specifics here, because some of this is still private. What I can say is this. When you own something through the right legal structure, when the properties are held in a trust and the business is structured correctly and your name does not appear on the public-facing records the way a person might assume, there is very little that someone can claim without your consent. Sylvia did not know she had married the night manager of an inn she could never touch. 2 weeks after our wedding, she and Donovan left. It didn't happen in a dramatic scene. I was almost disappointed, I think, some part of me that had wanted the confrontation, the clarity of it. Instead, Sylvia came to me one morning and said, with a kind of cold practicality, that she thought they should talk about a separation. She said she felt we weren't as compatible as she'd hoped. She said she needed someone who was more of a partner in the fullest sense. I said I understood. She looked at me for a moment. I think searching for something, disappointment or desperation, or some lever she could still use. I don't know what she found. Whatever it wasn't useful to her. They were gone by the afternoon. I stood in the lobby after their car pulled out of the lot and Dottie brought me coffee without being asked. I stood at the front window with the mountains in the distance and the familiar smell of the place around me. The old wood and the cleaning soap and the faint trace of the fireplace we'd lit the night before. I thought Gloria would have known in the first 5 minutes. I almost laughed. I did actually, a little, alone by the window. The quiet, embarrassed laugh of a man who knows himself well enough to understand exactly where he went wrong and exactly why, and can do nothing about it now except stand here and be honest with himself about it. I called Carolyn. She came up from Charlotte that Friday, and we sat on the back porch with blankets and hot coffee, and she didn't say anything for a long time. And then she said, "I love you, Dad." I said I loved her too. She said, "How are you actually feeling?" I thought about it. I said I felt grateful, mostly. Grateful that I had been watchful enough, even if not watchful enough in the right direction. Grateful that the things Gloria and I had built together were still intact. Grateful for Phil and for Dottie, and for Roger and for Grallen on this porch. There was loneliness underneath all of it, yes. There still is. That hasn't gone anywhere. But loneliness is not the worst thing a person can feel. I know that now better than I ever wanted to. I still run the night desk sometimes, more out of habit than necessity. I like the quiet of it, the lobby at 2 in the morning, the soft light and the sound of the mountains doing nothing at all. I stand there and sometimes I think about what it cost me and what it saved me, and how those two things are not always as different as you'd hope. I am 64 years old. I have made a lot of good decisions in my life, and a few poor ones, and the poor ones have always taught me something I did not know I needed to know. This one taught me to listen to my daughter. That might be the most valuable thing I've learned in years. I only wish I had learned it a week earlier. I still think about that morning Sylvia left her hands folded in her lap and told me it was time to think about all of us now. There was something almost rehearsed about the stillness of it, and I remember sitting across from her and feeling, underneath the sadness, a kind of quiet clarity, not triumph, just clarity. What happened to me wasn't random. I had opened a door without checking what was on the other side, and what came through that door followed a logic of its own, one I should have seen sooner. When a person moves quickly, when they answer vague questions with vaguer answers, when they make you feel chosen before they've really chosen to know you, that is information. I had the information. I just didn't want to read it. And the cost of that wasn't the marriage. The cost was the weeks of doubt, the parking lot phone calls, the look on Carolyn's face when I finally admitted she'd been right. What protected me in the end wasn't luck. It was something Gloria and I had built through years of careful, honest work. Not just the properties, but the habit of thinking clearly about what we were doing and why. That careful thinking didn't leave when she did. It was still in me, a little quieter maybe, a little slower to speak up, but still there. When Donovan started calling the inn the property, and Sylvia started leaving legal printouts on the kitchen table, something in me recognized the shape of what was happening before I was ready to name it. That recognition, that willingness to stay clear-eyed even when you don't want to be, is something you have to protect in yourself. Not because the world is full of bad people, though some of it is, but because your own loneliness, your own wanting, can blur things faster than any con ever could. I was lonely. That's the honest truth of it. And loneliness is not a character flaw. It is just a condition, like being cold or being tired. But you don't make permanent decisions when you're cold. You get a coat. You wait until your hands stop shaking and you can think straight again. I didn't wait long enough. That was my part in it. But I also did not fold. When the picture became clear, I did not pretend I wasn't seeing it. I called Phil. I talked to Roger. I listened to what Dottie had noticed without her having to say more than she needed to. I made the quiet, careful decisions that needed to be made. That kind of steadiness. The ability to keep functioning with a broken heart, to protect what matters even when you'd rather not have to. That is something you build over a lifetime of not giving up when things are hard. It doesn't announce itself, it just shows up when you need it. What I want to say, if any of this lands anywhere useful, is this: character is not what you do when everything is easy. It is what you do when you are 64 years old and standing in a parking lot at night calling your best friend because your marriage of 3 weeks is falling apart. It is whether you tell the truth to yourself in that moment. It is whether you still choose integrity when dishonesty would be cheaper and faster. Sylvia made her choices. Donovan made his. Those choices had their own weight, their own consequences. My job was only ever to be responsible for mine. Carolyn drove up from Charlotte that Friday, and we sat on the porch, and she didn't say a word about being right. She just sat with me. That, I think, is what real love actually looks like. Not the fast kind, not the kind that folds its hands and waits to see what you're worth, the kind that shows up on a cold Friday and stays. I still have the inn. I still run the night desk sometimes. And some mornings I stand at the front window with my coffee and I think, Gloria, I'm still learning. And I think she would have appreciated that. She always said the slowness wasn't my problem. The all-in was. She was right. She usually was.